Welcome to the Play Podcast with me, Douglas Schatz. Hello, and welcome to episode 23 of the Play Podcast, where we explore the greatest new and classic plays. I'm Douglas Schatz, founder and host of the Play Podcast. Our episode today will not be devoted to a single play, but will comprise a collection of what I've called footnotes to the episodes that we've recorded so far on the podcast. Loyal listeners may recall that I released a selection of these footnotes for the first 10 or 11 episodes back in episode 12. This is, therefore, Footnotes Volume 2, in which I will be mining the research and conversations that we've done on the plays in the past 10 episodes since then. Somewhat arbitrarily, I've rationalized that it makes sense to publish a selection of footnotes every 10 episodes. It feels like the right amount of material has been amassed, and it happens to coincide with a neat number of episodes. As per the definition of a footnote, these pieces will consist of anything from brief or even trivial bits of information to more extended observations on aspects of the play, some of which, I confess, may be nothing more than my own indulgent interpretation. I hope that you will find some of them interesting enough that it may inspire you to listen to an episode you haven't yet sampled. For future reference, I try to publish a few footnotes for every play that we cover on our website, which you're welcome to dip into following each episode. The first episode that followed the first Footnotes collection was devoted to the American classic Death of a Salesman by Arthur Miller. The title of the play refers, in fact, to the death of at least two salesmen. The play is the story of Willy Loman's decline, despair, and ultimately death, but Willy himself describes the death of another salesman, Dave Singelman, who he labels the greatest salesman of them all. Dave Singelman was a legend among salesmen, who apparently made all his sales by telephone while sitting in his hotel room wearing his trademark green velvet slippers. According to Willy, Dave Singelman died the true death of a salesman because he died in harness, still on the road at the age of 84, and at his funeral he was remembered by hundreds of salesmen and buyers. Willy tells the story of Dave Singelman to his boss Howard when he asks him to give him an office job. It is a passionate but rather desperate plea in which he is attempting to reclaim some of the dignity and respect that as a traditional, successful salesman, he believes he deserves. However, at this point in the declining trajectory of Willy's career, it is an honorable end that we and Willy know is now a fantasy. In fact, one of the themes of the play is that Willy Loman represents one of many millions of salesmen who Arthur Miller would contend have died in the service of the American dream. The title of the play is Death of a Salesman, not Death of the Salesman, because the is singular, while a suggests one of many. The choice of the title and of the characters' names in the play are carefully conceived. Dave Singelman evokes the solitariness of the salesman on the road, the man who is making his own way through the commissions on what he sells. Willy Loman suggests that he's low down in the Darwinian hierarchy of the corporate world. Arthur Miller ascribed the source of the Loman family name to a scene in a film by Fritz Lang called The Testament of Dr. Mabuse, in which a man in fear for his life is vainly shouting the name Loman down the telephone. The unseen Loman is someone who is not going to come to rescue him. In the film, the man ends up in a mental asylum, and Miller said that for him, what he associated with the name Loman was a terror-stricken man calling into the void for help that will never come, which is what, in essence, Willy is doing throughout the play. During our podcast on Death of a Salesman, my guest, Dr. Stephen Marino, one of the founders of the Arthur Miller Society, pointed out that one of the original sources of inspiration for the character of Willy Loman and his family was Miller's own uncle, Manny Newman. In his autobiography, Time Bends, Miller shares several details about the Newman family that could just as easily describe the Lomans in the play. He described a general air of hopeful energy that he sensed in the Newman household. Something good was always coming up. Not just good, but transforming, triumphant, which sounds like the grand hopes that Willie continuously conjures. Like Willie, according to Miller, his Uncle Manny was lyrically in love with fame and fortune, and the unpredictability of the salesman's fortunes also wove a romance around his life. The hope of making a killing was always possible. But Miller also admired the intrepid valor of the salesman, who endured the long journeys through New England winters and withstood the inevitable put-downs and failures that are part of the job. Salesmen, he said, lived like artists, like actors, whose product is first of all themselves, imagining triumphs in a world that ignores them. It is striking how Miller the writer associates his dreams for personal acclaim with those of the salesman. The echoes of his Uncle Manny Newman with the Lohman family extend to Manny's wife, who, like Linda Lohman in the play, Miller says she bore the cross of reality for them all, keeping her calm, enthusiastic smile, lest he feel he was not being appreciated. How often has this been a wife's role? There is also an autobiographical source in the psychology of the relationship between Willie and his son Biff in the play. The defining moment in this relationship occurs when Biff discovers that his father is having an affair, and that changes his view of his father forever thereafter. One of the most challenging aspects of any father-son relationship is the inevitable realization by a son that his father is fallible and is subject to weakness and mistakes like any human being. At the same time, given a father's unquestioned authority in the early years, he may naturally expect to receive continuing respect, even perhaps some payback for his sacrifices in supporting his children. Miller himself experienced a challenge such as this when dealing with his own father's fall from grace as a business tycoon. Miller told of his father coming to him in 1947 to ask him for money as his business was struggling. His father assumed that Miller could afford to help him following the financial success of his breakthrough play All My Sons on Broadway. He describes the discomfort that he felt in response to his father's need and his unapologetic justification for asking him, and he confessed that his view of his father cooled forever thereafter. Only a year later, he would write the piercing portrait of a father in decline and a son breaking free in Death of a Salesman. In these times when Black Lives Matter has lifted awareness of the issues around enduring endemic racism, I was especially pleased and privileged to talk with Anglo-Caribbean playwright Winsome Pinnock about her powerful play Rockets and Blue Lights. Rockets and Blue Lights is a beautifully constructed play, a thought-provoking and moving re-examination of the ongoing legacy of the slave trade. One of the footnotes that initially intrigued me about the play was that Winsome cited J.M.W. Turner's painting The Slave Ship as one of the inspirations for writing it. The painting, which currently hangs in the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, depicts a ship foundering in a tumultuous sea. At first sight, a typical Turner seascape. Except, if you look closely, you will pick out in the foreground figures drowning in the sea. Look even more closely, and you will realize that these are slaves with irons on their limbs who have been thrown overboard from the ship. The painting was first exhibited at the Royal Academy Summer Exhibition in 1840. Although by this time slavery had been outlawed in the British Empire, illegal trade was still going on, and abolitionists also continued to campaign for it to be outlawed in the rest of the world. As Winsome noted in her preface to Rockets and Blue Lights, the painting may have been based on the Zong Massacre of 1781, the events of which were well known as a result of a prominent court case of it in 1783. The Zong sailed from Accra in Ghana, headed for Jamaica, with 442 enslaved people on board, more than twice the number of people that it could safely transport. The ship unknowingly sailed past Jamaica and was running low on supplies, so the captain took the decision to throw 54 women and children overboard into the sea. 2 days later, 42 more male enslaved people were thrown overboard, and 36 more followed in the next few days. A total of 132 people were murdered in this way. On its return, the ship's owners claimed compensation from their insurers for the loss of the enslaved people. But the insurers refused to honor the claim, and the owners took them to court in March 1783. The facts and testimony of the case are shocking to read. The law of the time held that if enslaved people died a natural death at sea or on shore, then no compensation could be claimed. However, a ship's captain would be within the law to jettison part of his cargo in order to save the rest, and could claim insurance for its value. The value of an enslaved person was set in law at £30 per person. On this basis, in the first trial, the jury had no doubt that the case of slaves was the same as if horses had been thrown overboard. The question was whether there was not an absolute necessity for throwing them overboard to save the rest. The crew had claimed that it had been necessary because there had not been enough fresh water to keep all of the people alive for the remainder of the voyage. But on appeal in the second trial, new evidence was revealed that heavy rain had fallen on the second day of the killings, and more people were thrown overboard even thereafter. Technically, therefore, absolute necessity could not be proved, and the insurers were not required to pay up. The verdict never addressed the fact that innocent people were murdered. In the final scene of Rockets and Blue Lights, Thomas, a black merchant seaman, has been illegally abducted and transported to Brazil to work as a slave. He is being guarded by an overseer with a gun pointed at him. Thomas begins to sing as he labors. When the guard orders him to stop, he carries on. The guard threatens him with his rifle, to which Thomas boldly responds, "I'm not surprised by your fear of me. After all, I have survived much. I have survived the slave castles at Bonny, the Zong and Baptist massacres. I was there, witnessed all, survived it. I survived the fires of New Cross and Grenfell, death in custody. Through all this, I lived. As a black man, no matter what you've done over centuries, I have survived." And then Thomas and the rest of the cast chant the names of black victims who have suffered the same oppression over history, and whose names and spirits survive. I confess that I was not familiar with all of the names that the cast recite at this point, and was glad to be prompted to go to look them up. Ya Asantewa was a queen of the Ashanti Empire in what is now Ghana, who led a war against the colonial British in 1900. Yvonne Ruddock died along with 12 other young black people in a fire at her birthday party at her home in New Cross, London in 1981. Arson was suspected. David Oluwale was a homeless man who drowned in a river in Leeds in 1969 after being chased by police officers. It resulted in the first successful prosecution of British police officers for involvement in the death of a black person. Sam Sharp led a slave rebellion in Jamaica in 1832 and was executed. Kelso Cochrane was a 32-year-old carpenter from Antigua who was walking home in Notting Hill, London in May 1959 when he was set upon and stabbed to death by a gang of white youths. Stephen Lawrence. I would hope that his name is known by everyone who lives in the UK, as his case has been emblematic of the senseless cost of racism in some parts of British society. He is the black British teenager who was murdered while waiting for a bus in southeast London in April 1993. The litany of names reminded me of the ending of Tom Stoppard's last play, Leopoldstrasse, which concludes with the recitation of names of his Jewish ancestors who perished in the Nazi death camps. The list of names spoken by Thomas at the end of Rockets and Blue Lights is similarly immensely moving and powerful. It is both a tribute to those who have gone before and a statement of determination to survive and arrive at a new, free future. I was especially honored to be able to talk with Sir Christopher Hampton in episode 15 about Florian Zeller's play The Father, which Christopher translated from the original French. Sir Christopher is, of course, a multi-award-winning playwright and screenwriter in his own right, and I feel even luckier to have had the chance to speak with him, having heard just this week that he's been nominated for an Oscar for Best Adapted Screenplay for his work with Florian on the film version of The Father. I can't wait to see the film when it finally arrives in cinemas in the UK. It has been much delayed by COVID, but last I read it is now due to be released in June. It has earned 6 Oscar nominations in all, including for Anthony Hopkins and Olivia Colman in the leading roles. The Father presents a piercing portrait of a family living with dementia. Anyone who has witnessed the cruel effects of the disease will recognize painful truths in the portrayal of the father, Andre, and his daughter Anne, as they struggle to navigate the practical and emotional challenges of Andre's increasing dementia. The play gains its unsettling power not just from the accuracy of its observations, but also from its inventive dramatic form, where the unities of time and space are disrupted, so that watching in the theater, we find ourselves vicariously experiencing Andre's mental confusion. One of the features of the film that I'm most intrigued to see how it deals with is the changing set that was such an integral device in the staging of the play. We talked during the episode about the deliberate confusion that the playwright creates around the specific identity of the setting on stage. For example, the stage direction that precedes the first scene in the published text of the play reads simply, Andre's flat. It seems clear from the dialogue that Anne is indeed visiting Andre in his flat during this opening scene. So far, so good. The printed stage direction for the second scene says, same room. However, during the course of the scene, the man playing Anne's husband, Pierre, tells Andre that this is their flat, not his, as he believes. So that doesn't add up. A further obfuscation is contained in the set direction for the next scene, which states, simultaneously the same room and a different room. How is that possible? What's going on? The stage direction gives us another clue when it continues, some furniture has disappeared. As the scenes proceed, the set sheds certain elements until it becomes an empty, neutral space. I do recall noticing the gradual removal of elements of the set when I originally saw the play. The designer had very cleverly created a room that as the play proceeded could at a glance be both the original room and a different one. It retained enough continuity to suggest we may be in the same place, but there were changes, so that in the end we were unable to specifically identify where we were. This was very unsettling, because we could not stop our minds from trying to figure out where we are, and in so doing, the play was reproducing in us the same confusion about his surroundings that Andre is feeling. It is possible to imagine how this effect can be achieved with changes to a static theatrical set, so I'm keen to see how the film recreates this result. When I think that we assume that as a medium, film creates a wider and perhaps more literal representation of the real world. We shall see. I think that the play was such a success not just because of its innovative dramatic form, but because audiences recognized truthful details in Andre's behavior as he wrestles with dementia, and in the family's challenges to deal with it. Florian Zeller has said that the play was inspired by his own experience of the disease with his grandmother, who he grew up with and who started to suffer from dementia when he was 15. I referred a number of times in the podcast to specific features of the illness that the play displays which resonated with me from my own experiences of my mother's dementia. And I well recall in the lobby outside the theater overhearing many people having the same personal reactions. It certainly touched an emotional nerve for many. One of the details that hit home for me was the fact that Andre is repeatedly preoccupied during the play by the whereabouts of his wristwatch. As Sir Christopher pointed out during our conversation, it is not uncommon for people suffering from dementia to lose things, including by putting them away in a specific place and then forgetting their having done so. We all do this, of course, but it becomes more of a problem with the advanced loss of short-term memory. For Andre, the special place for his watch is a particular kitchen cupboard, and when Anne finds it there for him, rather than be grateful, he is offended that she knows about his hiding place. Her knowing something so personal feels like an invasion of his privacy, but his anger is also an expression of his frustration and fear at his own frailties. As James Joyce said, all anger is anger with yourself. Andre's disproportionate preoccupation with his watch is partly an indication of the narrowing focus of his mind, but it is also an emotional symbol of his search for order. He may realize that he is now not sure to identify what time in the day it is without it. His wearing it may also represent a simple need to reclaim his own identity. As I suggested in the podcast, we can relate to his sense that he may not feel properly dressed without it. So it is a potent symbol of the disintegration of his world. It is nearly 40 years ago that David Mamet's play Oleanna first shocked audiences with its snapshot of the dangers of patriarchal power. The scenario it presented of a male university professor locked in a battle of behavior and ethics with a female student that culminates in an explosion of violence sparked heated debate about misogyny and political correctness. The recent tragedy of Sarah Everard's murder and the huge response to it shows us all too clearly that the questions the play raises remain dismayingly relevant. The subject or significance of the play are not immediately obvious from its strange title. Researching the source or meaning of Oleanna seemed like the perfect content for a footnote, and sure enough, it is an arcane reference. Oleanna, or New Norway, was the name given to an utopian settlement founded in 1852 in the Allegheny Mountains in Pennsylvania by a Norwegian violinist, Ole Bull. Despite his idealistic intentions and much publicity in Norway, the settlement failed within a year because of a practical reality. The land was not arable enough to support them. The high-profile failure of the project inspired a Norwegian folk song satirizing its utopian dream. The song was translated into English as Oleanna and popularized by Pete Seeger. So what does this reference signify in the play? Perhaps it suggests that the professor, and by extension the patriarchy of the university and the world at large, are complacent and deluded about the nature of the world they have created and rule over. That it is not the utopia they imagine, but one that serves only them well, and that their power and privilege will prove to be vulnerable to challenge in the form of the woman who calls them out. There was a prominent real-life example of a woman attempting to speak truth to power in the news at the time that Mamet completed his play in 1992. In 1991, in Washington, the Senate committee hearings into the appointment of Justice Clarence Thomas to the U.S. Supreme Court were shocked by the testimony of respected university professor Anita Hill that she had been sexually harassed by Thomas when working for him at the Department of Education some years previously. Hill's account provoked intense and divisive reactions. Supporters of Hill accused the chairman of the committee of a cover-up when he ruled that supporting witnesses could not be called. The chairman was none other than one Joe Biden. Thomas's appointment was narrowly approved, and Hill was subsequently hounded from her position at the University of Oklahoma Law School. David Mamet said that he wrote the first draft of Oleanna 8 months before the hearings, but was inspired to take it out of his drawer again by the Hill-Thomas scandal. Mamet has consistently avoided being drawn on his specific views of the Hill-Thomas hearings or of the play's interpretation of the issues raised, insisting that the play does not deliberately take sides. What is certain is that the ugly events aired at the Hill-Thomas hearing cannot be dismissed as ancient history. Witness the dismayingly similar scenario and result that played out in the Senate committee hearings of 2018 for the appointment of another Supreme Court judge, Brett Kavanaugh, who was approved by the same narrow margin as Thomas, despite the testimony of Christine Blasey Ford that she had been sexually assaulted by him, as well as reports from 2 further women who accused Kavanaugh. It is difficult not to conclude that little has changed in the balance of institutional patriarchal power or in the personal threat that male violence represents to individual women. A woman who knew all too well the dangers of challenging power in a patriarchal world was certainly the Duchess of Malfi, who in John Webster's tragedy of 1612 pays with her life. More than 400 years since the play was written, the Duchess remains an icon of female resistance, intelligence, and integrity. The play is irresistibly theatrical, notorious for its bloody plot. My first footnote was to discover that the playwright's father, also named John Webster, was by trade a coachmaker based near Smithfield Market in London. His business also hired out their coaches as hearses and for the transport of criminals. It is not a stretch, I think, to surmise that the young Webster's immersion in this world may have sparked his dark imagination and informed his understanding of villainy and death. The play is set in an earthly world of ruthless ambition and intrigue, but in the ideology of the time, this world is also one ruled over by the existential battle between the devil and God. The play is soaked in sin and death, and the characters are persistently haunted by their prospects in the afterlife. For these people, heaven, and especially hell, are very real places, although, of course, they cannot know what is to come and fear the unknown. The Duchess asks her waiting lady, Cariola, if she thinks we shall know one another in the other world, and laments that we cannot see into this afterworld to know what it is like. Oh, that it were possible we might but hold some 2 days' conference with the dead. From them I should learn somewhat, I am sure, I shall never know here. The image of having a conference with the dead is one that mankind has always yearned for, and the threshold to the afterworld is conjured in an even more vivid image when the Duchess is facing death herself, and her assassin Bosala asks her what her preferred method of death will be. She responds, "I know death hath 10,000 several doors, for men to take their exits, and 'tis found they go on strange geometrical hinges, you may open both ways." There are countless ways to exit this life. Does the swinging door suggest that one may either be called to death or choose to push through it oneself, or even, of course, that we may pass between the worlds as ghosts? The Duchess is certain that one must approach heaven with humility, that arrogant princes will not be admitted. Heaven gates are so highly arched as princes' palaces, that they enter there must go on their knees. As you can see, I have been drawn into quoting at length from the play because in addition to the rollicking plot and the indomitable character of the Duchess, the play has also endured because of the vivid poetry of its language. In the podcast, my guest, Professor Emma Smith, described Webster's verse as being characteristic of the style of the metaphysical poets of the 17th century, such as John Donne. The term metaphysical was coined by Samuel Johnson, and it refers to the use of extended metaphors and wordplay, as well as an interest in the interplay between the physical and spiritual worlds. We have seen these features in some of the lines I've been quoting. There are countless other examples of vivid extended metaphor in the play that make reading the text such a pleasure, and I'm afraid that I can't resist quoting just a few more. For example, in Act 1, Scene 1, the melancholic spokesman Bosala describes the corruption of the Amalfi court, presided over by the Cardinal and Ferdinand. He likens the 2 brothers to 2 plum trees that grow crooked over standing pools. They are rich and o'erladen with fruit, but none but crows, pies, and caterpillars feed on them. Could I be one of their flattering panders, I would hang on their ears like a horse leech till I were full, and then drop off. Parasites sucking the spoils of court from the kings. Bossela has another telling image of the unhealthy hierarchy of the court. Places in the court are but like beds in the hospital, where this man's head lies at that man's foot, and so lower and lower. You can see the beds lined up and practically smell the stench of illness. One of my favorite images, because of its vivid absurdity, comes from Ferdinand when in his madness he conjures a conceit to describe his patience. I am studying the art of patience, to drive 6 snails from this town to Moscow. Neither use goad nor whip to them, but let them take their own time. The patience the man in the world match me for an experiment, and I'll crawl after like a sheep biter. Finally, the most extended metaphysical conceit of all must be the Duchess's famous fable of the salmon and the dogfish at the close of Act 3 of the play, in which she expounds a tale to illustrate the ultimate fates of men of both high and mean birth. The salmon dares to leave its lowly station in the river to mix with the higher-ranked dogfish in the sea. The dogfish is most put out that the salmon fails to show due reverence to its superior station, to which the salmon reminds him that it is not till they are in the fisher's basket that their value can be truly known. In the fish market, the salmon's price may be higher. Perhaps another nod to the judgment coming to all in the afterlife. The context for the eschatological debate couldn't have been more different in our next play, Michael Frayn's Copenhagen, in which the questions of man's moral darkness are considered in the realm of nuclear physics and its potential application in weapons of mass destruction. The protagonists in this debate are the Nobel Prize-winning scientists Niels Bohr and Werner Heisenberg. Bohr and Heisenberg had formed a close friendship when they worked together in the 1920s, but when they come together in occupied Copenhagen in 1941, they are antagonists caught up in the conflict of World War II. Bohr is Danish and of Jewish ancestry. Heisenberg is German and is working on the Nazi program to develop nuclear fission. The potential for nuclear fission to be used to create weapons is not yet fully known, but the question of the scientist's moral responsibility for pursuing such a dangerous course is at the heart of the debate between the two men at their momentous meeting. At one point during their conversation, Heisenberg refers to the darkness inside the human soul, and in the same breath he alludes to the castle of Elsinore. Elsinore is about 50 kilometers north of Copenhagen, and the two scientists visited it together on a walking tour back in the early days of their friendship. The castle is, of course, famous as the setting for Shakespeare's play Hamlet, and it is this notoriety as a place pervaded by darkness that Heisenberg acknowledges when Bohr's wife Margrethe asks him what he was thinking when he chose to collaborate with the Nazis. His response, Elsinore, is a shorthand for the darkness of the human soul. During Bohr and Heisenberg's extended conversation in the play, they naturally refer to some of the theories of physics which underpin the process of nuclear fission, and which also provoke philosophical questions. I confess that even when I spent some time looking up the references to Bohr's theory of complementarity or Heisenberg's uncertainty principle, it wasn't long before my head began to spin with trying to follow the knotty logic involved. It is one of the joys of the play, however, that metaphors for these theories resonate with the personal and political themes. Some of these are simple enough for me to recognize. For example, Heisenberg describes the interaction of Bohr, Margrethe, and himself with a beautiful analogy to the structure of an atom. Margrethe is the nucleus, Bohr an electron in random motion around her, and Heisenberg the photon, a quantum of light that seeks out and collides with Bohr. This image reinforces our sense of Margrethe as the fixed center of the relationship between them, around which the scientists are whirling in the scattered combat of their discussions and of their friendship. The theories of complementarity or uncertainty could also be thought to apply to our understanding Heisenberg's motives in seeking the famous meeting with Bohr, or of his work with the Nazis. It remains impossible, for example, to accurately reconcile the complementary forces of Heisenberg's myriad personal allegiances to his country, to his family and friends, or to a moral responsibility for the dangerous applications of his scientific research. Finally, for this meeting with Bohr, these include the starkly complementary facts that, as he says, "I'm your enemy, I'm also your friend." One of my favorite analogies is focused on the mystery that is at the very heart of the play, that no one knows what was said between Bohr and Heisenberg when they met in Copenhagen in 1941, because a crucial part of their meeting took place in the garden where they were out of range of any surveillance. As Margaret points out, what the two scientists actually said to each other cannot be predicted because, as quantum theory states, particles behave differently when they're unobserved. Another reference in the play that prompted me to pursue further research to flesh out a footnote is the moment when Heisenberg describes the time he spent at Farm Hall in Cambridgeshire in 1945. Heisenberg was actually captured by the Allies in July 1945 and brought to England, where he and 9 other German scientists were held for 6 months at a country house named Farm Hall. In the play, Heisenberg gives a wonderfully evocative description of the scene of their imprisonment. The German scientists and their English captors enjoy fine dinners. Heisenberg plays the piano, and one of the English hosts reads Dickens aloud. All the while, their conversations and interviews are being recorded and transcribed to glean information about the German nuclear programs. The scene has all the makings of a play in itself, a classic English country house drama, shaded with the dark undertones of the war. As if on cue for the playwright, the perfect inciting incident is dropped into this scenario, when on 6th of August 1945, the scientists at Farm Hall learned that the U.S. had dropped the atomic bomb on Hiroshima. At first, there was disbelief that a bomb had been built and used, and in the weeks that followed, the German scientists discussed how the Allies could have built the bomb, as well as the morality of doing so. The Farm Hall transcripts reveal that Heisenberg, along with some of the other interned physicists, was glad the Allies had won the war. Apparently, Heisenberg told other scientists that he had never contemplated building a bomb, only an atomic reactor to produce energy. On the failure of the German nuclear weapons program to build a bomb, Heisenberg is quoted as saying, "We wouldn't have had the moral courage to recommend to the government in the spring of 1942 that they should employ 120,000 men just for building the thing up." This is one of the arguments that he presents in the play, stating specifically that he had personally advised Albert Speer, Germany's Minister of Armaments, that it would cost too much money and manpower to build a nuclear weapon within a practical time frame. He and his team were focused thereafter only on the development of nuclear power to support the war effort. As Michael Frayn suggested in our conversation, though, Heisenberg's account of the past may have been edited with the benefit of hindsight, given the changed perspective on this history. Whatever the truth, the events at Farm Hall in 1945 have the makings of a fascinating play. Lucy Kirkwood's wonderful play, The Welkin, is another play with a title whose meaning I didn't recognize. Lucy explained that the Welkin is a literary or poetic term for the highest part of the sky, or of heaven. It comes from the Old English word Welkin, for cloud or sky. We talked a bit in the episode about the metaphoric meanings associated with the sky, including, of course, as the location of heaven, and of the stars or comets, to which mankind has long attributed some form of influence over its fate or fortunes. Why do we look to the sky as a source of supernatural power? Perhaps in a practical sense, simply because it's the source of the weather on which our material existence depends. One of the characters, Kitty, neatly expresses this more utilitarian vision of the sky. "I never look up at the sky, not unless I have washing on the line." We are also entranced by the sky because we know so little about its vastness. It represents an infinite unknowable. The play is set in 1759, a time when religion and superstition inform how people understand the workings of the world, believing fundamentally that their destinies are determined by a higher authority or forces. A number of the characters, for example, are convinced that the mysterious appearance of a comet must be a portent of change in their earthly lives. 1759 was a year when Halley's comet was returning. One of the women tells how her grandmother saw an angel the last time that the comet visited, and then gave birth to a boy with 2 thumbs. For Sally, the central character, who is on trial for a murder she helped her lover commit, she believes her destiny was sealed when she looked to the sky and prayed for escape from the tyranny of her husband and her life. The comet appeared as if to answer her call, for at that same moment her new lover walked into her life, pulling her inexorably in the grip of passion to their shared terrible fate. The epigraph that prefaces the published text of the play is from Shakespeare's play Julius Caesar. When beggars die, there are no comets seen. This is the first part of Calpurnia's warning to Caesar to try to dissuade him from going to the Senate on the morning of the Ides of March. To her, the comet recently seen in Rome may prefigure the death of princes. In the Welkin, I think the epigraph stands less for the significance of the astronomical symbol than for the point that ordinary people's deaths, or lives even, are seldom noted in society or featured in art. As a point of contrast, they are in this play. In fact, one of the great strengths of Lucy's play is the array of distinctive individual characters that are assembled from the local community to serve on the jury of matrons who will determine Sally's sentence for her crime. One of these is Anne, who introduces herself as follows. "My name is Anne Lavender, without an E. I was christened with one, but my husband felt me more elegant without it. We moved here more recently to raise our 4 daughters in peasant honesty. William is a poet, and had a desire to share the housework equally and take many long solitary walks. He has been very successful at the latter." I was fascinated to learn from Lucy that Anne is based in part on the figure of Sarah Coleridge, whose life with the romantic poet Samuel Taylor Coleridge was one of long-suffering middle-class poverty. She was born Sarah Fricker, but like Anne, dropped the H from her name to please her husband. Through the 40 years of their marriage, Sarah carried the burden of childcare and domestic survival. Coleridge, spending most of his time absent from the family home, absorbed by his literary contemplation, drug addiction, and various infatuations with other women. In the play, the poet's wife Anne is a character with a sharp and inquiring intelligence. In another age, she, like Sarah Coleridge, née Fricker, may have had the chance of a more independent life. Still talking of titles, Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf by Edward Albee is certainly one of the most memorable titles in dramatic history. In fact, it wasn't Albee's original title. He was several months into writing the play before he adopted the phrase as a recurring symbolic refrain in the play, at which point he added it as a subtitle. Up to that point, his working title was Exorcism, which suggests that he had a clear vision of one of the themes of his play, that through the course of the action, the characters would be purged of the illusions that they have preserved in their relationships. In the end, he named the 3rd act The Exorcism, during which, of course, George and Martha expressly exorcise their imaginary son. The final title of the play not only has a magical musical rhythm, it also summons several meanings, lampooning the pretensions of academia with its reference to Virginia Woolf, and with the nursery rhyme reference to the big bad wolf, suggesting the psychological demons that afflict the characters. The play is, of course, remembered primarily for the relentlessly vicious battle that is played out between Martha and George, played so memorably by Elizabeth Taylor and Richard Burton in the film. In the same way as one relishes analyzing the blow-by-blow of sport, there is rich reward in reviewing the to and fro of George and Martha's epic battle. The central challenge of the play is to decipher the underlying truth of their relationship through all of the ferocity and nuance of their struggle. Their initial exchanges, for example, are fabulously funny, partly because of the dazzling sharpness of their repartee, but also because we feel that at some level they too are enjoying the fight as a game. As George says to the younger man Nick, who is a horrified witness to their savagery, "Martha and I are merely exercising. That's all. We're merely walking what's left of our wits." The conflict they incite together is performative, a means of simultaneously addressing and avoiding the truth of their relationship and lives, testing what is real or not, but without really facing the consequences. They are picking at the scabs of their unhappiness, daring themselves to see if they can survive the open wounds. Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf is such a rich play that the footnotes that I compiled for our episode on it include some extended interpretation of the themes that it raises. For example, there are a number of ways in which the characters of the two men in the play, George and Nick, are set up in contrast. Not only are they obviously avatars of age and youth, and become sexual rivals when Martha turns her attention to Nick, but they also stand for contrasting values in the play. George represents the traditional social establishment of America, being native to New England, where the country was originally founded. He resides in the rarefied, protected habitat of the university campus, albeit also now a complacent, decadent, even sterile environment. Whereas Nick is from the Midwest, the frontier of the country. He represents a youthful ambition and ruthless sexual confidence, propelled by physical vigor. His ambition is unencumbered by obeisance to established social hierarchies or concern for anyone other than himself. Nick is the modern science of biology, the department he belongs to at the university, whereas George is history, the drag of the past. The repeated references to biology underscore the theme of gender and reproduction, about which both couples are so preoccupied. George refers frequently to biologists working with chromosomes to create the perfect man, for example. There is, of course, much sparring between Martha and George about how much of a man he is or not, including compared to Nick, who is proud of his physique. And the references to the biological creation of life cannot but remind us of both couples' inability to conceive. Another theme that pervades the play is that of parents and their children, or lack thereof. As we touched on in the podcast, it is difficult not to trace this preoccupation back to the facts of Alby's own unhappy adoption. Alby said many times that he did not feel positively attached to his adoptive parents, and he admitted that in the play's fixation on the subject, he was aware of some connective thematic tissue with his own experience. There is certainly a lack of positive parental role models in the play. Martha has an unhealthy fixation on her authoritarian father. George may or may not have killed both of his parents. Honey's father was a charlatan, possibly even a criminal priest. And we know nothing of Nick's parents, which is a telling lacuna in itself, for he is a character without roots or allegiances. To return to a more customary form of factual footnote, we reported in the podcast that the Pulitzer Prize jury of 1962 labeled Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf a filthy play. It is not clear whether they had in mind the obscenity of the language or the graphic ugliness of the behavior on show, or both. It is likely that they were offended by the language. Alby's first draft of the play contained numerous fucks, motherfuckers, and shits, but when theatrical colleagues suggested that it would be hard to get it produced, he replaced these with watered-down equivalents such as screwed, hell, and crap. The play ran foul of the censor when it was first produced in London in 1964. The Lord Chamberlain still presided over censorship in the theatre in Britain, as it had done since the time of Shakespeare. Alby explained to those unfamiliar with the British censorship regime that the role of the Lord Chamberlain was, in his words, to make plays safe for the royal family, if they ever went to the theatre. The Lord Chamberlain requested pages of changes to the obscenities in Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf, although they allowed George's name for one of his games, Hump the Hostess, to remain, because, apparently, hump was used in Shakespeare. The producers told the actors in London to ignore the requested changes, which they largely did. Tennessee Williams's play The Glass Menagerie is now a standard on educational curricula and in theatrical revivals. It is loved for its emotional portrait of the Wingfield family, but it is also admired for its theatrical technique. The narrator of the play tells us in the opening speech, "The play is memory. Being a memory play, it is dimly lighted. It is sentimental. It is not realistic." In fact, Williams includes a lengthy note in the text of the play on the use and importance of the lighting in the staging of the play. It starts with the statement, "The lighting in the play is not realistic. In keeping with the atmosphere of memory, the stage is dim. Shafts of light are focused on selected areas or actors." This approach to the lighting is all part of his deliberate intent to create a non-naturalistic form of theater. This form suits the content of the play because it expresses the flickering, subjective quality of Tom's memory, which is the source of everything that we see. The style is also a feature of Williams' avowed artistic method, in that he says that his purpose in his writing is to convey a picture of my own heart, an emotional truth, in other words. He conceives that this can be achieved by creating what he called sculptural drama, which is a more three-dimensional, sensory theatrical experience that is not reliant solely or primarily on the words, but also on striking visual images and evocative music. The imaginative use of light can engender what he called a mobile, plastic quality to plays of a more or less static nature. The lighting in this play is certainly central to our understanding of its emotional truth and to the beauty that enraptures us. As Williams points out, for example, the light upon Laura should be distinct from the others, having a peculiar pristine clarity, such as light used in early religious portraits of female saints or Madonnas. Or he might have added, of the light that reflects off the figures of the Glass Menagerie itself. The candlelight that illuminates the climactic love scene between Laura and Jim evokes the dreamlike softness of their fleeting moment of romance. I imagine that this play must be a joy for lighting designers to work on. Time is the greatest distance between two places. This is just one of the play's many wonderful phrases. It is in Tom's final speech as the narrator when he takes us back to the beginning, reminding us that this is a memory play and that there is a great distance back to our past. Tom's memories are full of pain and regret. Regret that he cannot fix the past, especially for his sister Laura. The guilt he feels about his abandoning her haunts him. His memory won't let him go. "I tried to leave you behind me, but I am more faithful than I intended to be." All of the characters in the play fail to bridge the distance to their past in a way that allows them to truthfully connect with their present. Amanda's memory of her romantic past is overshadowed by the reality that she chose the wrong man, with disastrous consequences. Laura has a false memory of herself at school, overestimating the notice that others made of her disability, tragically inhibiting herself. The whole play affirms the impossibility of our accurately reconstructing our past, and the fluid form of the play reaffirms the fact that our memories are not linear or rational. As Williams tells us once again, memory is non-realistic. It is seated predominantly in the heart. As we learned from Tom, the play is set sometime around 1938-39. What is the import of the play being set at this time? Tom makes specific references to Picasso's painting of Guernica, painted in 1937 following the indiscriminate bombing of the town by Nazi warplanes allied with General Franco in the Spanish Civil War. And he also references Neville Chamberlain's appeasement of Hitler in September 1938. At the time the play premiered, in 1944, Tom would have been speaking to the audience from the vantage point of the war that followed these events, and which America was now engaged in. Tom's references to Guernica and Chamberlain carry some moral judgment, his implication being that America and the Allies were fatally complacent in their responses to Hitler or Franco. At the same time, he is telling us that it is art, such as Picasso's, that draws attention to the truth. Tom refers somewhat elliptically to the explosive changes in the world that the characters don't see coming in 1938. Although, of course, the audience will know what he means when he concisely and poetically identifies the impending change as being caught up in the folds of Chamberlain's umbrella. The cataclysmic world changes that Tom describes are aligned with his own youthful urge for adventure. The war is somehow compensation for lives that passed like mine without any change or adventure. A time when adventure becomes available to the masses, as he says to Jim. It's a naive idea about war as adventure, indicating perhaps the depth of Tom's desire for change in his life and in the society around him. Williams propounds an idea of the artist, who in the play is the young Tom, as an exceptional individual who will distinguish himself from the masses and lead a more truthful and energetic life. But has Tom's bid for adventure to distinguish himself succeeded? In fact, when he finally escapes the family apartment, he didn't go to the moon, he only left St. Louis. The picture we get is of his drifting, swept along like dead leaves. And as he addresses us at the end of the play, in 1944, he is wearing a sailor's uniform. He tells us, nowadays the world is lit by lightning. Perhaps he's about to find that adventure he seeks after all. Our most recent episode was about Samuel Bailey's amazing debut play, Shook, which is set in a young offenders institution. It is sharp and funny and very moving. It is also unsettling because it challenges us to examine our own ingrained social prejudices. One of the characters, Kane, a young inmate, expresses the issue succinctly when he says, "I'm always going to be a problem to people like him." He is referring to the prison governor, who he rightly assumes lives in a separate world to him and his fellow inmates, as do we. It is not just the practical problem of having to lock offenders away to protect ourselves that Kane is describing. It is a much wider general attitude that amounts to social prejudice. His phrase encapsulates the wariness we feel about people from different classes of society who we know little about and dismiss or fear. "And he's telling me I'm the problem?" he goes on. "Thinking he's better than me? I'm always going to be a problem to people like him, innit? Nothing I ever do is right. Where I live is a problem. What music I listen to is a problem. What I wear is a problem. Whenever we have kids, it's a problem. They should just fucking come clean and admit they just don't like us, and that's why they locked us up in here." Who among us has not made judgments such as these about people from other social classes or circumstances? It is all too easy to disparage, even write off people who are not like us. What we see in the characters of the young inmates, Kane, Jonjo, and Riyadh, are complex human beings who certainly have flaws and who have done harm to others, but who also have talents and inherent goodness. Kane again challenges Grace, the teacher who comes in to teach the parenting class they are attending in the prison, to consider who is good. When Jonjo asks Grace if her son Alex is good, she replies, "Pretty good." But Kane realizes that the question is deeper than that, because he knows that it is difficult to say of them that they are pretty good. Their badness has not been trivial, robbing people, hurting them, and from a young age. The implication, I think, is that somehow their lack of goodness is inherent or an inevitable function of the failures of character or behavior in their families or class. As George Turvey, our guest, says so rightly in our conversation about the play, our view of these boys also stands for our views more generally of others who are less privileged and is not limited to just confirmed criminals. The positive power of the play, however, is, as George said, that it makes us care about people that normally we would cross the road to avoid, which is the beginning of true empathy. The playwright, Sam Bailey, said in the podcast, "Parenting is empathy." We talked a lot about parenting in the podcast, including the inescapable impact that our upbringing or our behavior as a parent has on our own or our children's lives. We also talked about the boys' instinctive desire to be good parents, hence their taking part in the parenting course in the prison, despite Riyadh's proclamation that parenting can't be taught. He contradicts himself, however, when he sensibly suggests to Grace that parenting skills should be taught in school, along with other practical life skills, like how'd you get a flat or vote, especially for people like him in case you ain't got no one to show you. The lack of parenting role models does, of course, have a huge practical impact on the lives of these boys. When Sam said that parenting is empathy, he also identified, however, the emotive meaning of being a parent and the emotional cost to these boys who have not benefited from it. Grace explained that for all of the practical skills she tries to impart, parenting ultimately boils down to being there when they come to you to make it better. And Kane speaks for all of us, I think, when he tells Riyadh that by the time parents are responsible for looking after teenagers, they're all just making it up as they go along. So what parenting finally is learning to care for someone else. And most poignantly, what these boys crave is to learn how to love and to be loved. This is vividly expressed in the final image of Jonjo cradling the baby at the close of the play. The lifeless doll substituting for his real baby he is unable to touch, and the comfort he himself has been denied. That's it for Volume 2 of our Footnotes. We're all caught up now. Time and editorial restraint has prevented me from repeating all of the footnotes published on our website, so if you've still not had enough, you're welcome to browse these online. And do check them out after each episode, if, like me, you generally quite fancy the snippets of information you can find in a footnote. Next time, normal service will resume when we explore another great, new, or classic play. Thanks for listening.
Thanks for listening. To listen to other episodes, to find out news about future episodes, or to leave comments about what you've heard, please visit us at www.theplaypodcast.com. You can also follow us on Facebook or on Twitter at theplaypod. You're also welcome to email plays@theplaypodcast.com to suggest plays that we could talk about in future episodes. You can also register your suggestion on the website. Thanks again, and see you next time.